on today's StoryBeat.
I believe that light kind of pushes, and I love backlight because it's pushing the actors toward us. It's really that sense of the halo of backlight, which for me, metaphorically, I think actors are angels. I mean, sometimes, you can hate them, right? But I do think that it's an angelic instinct to walk on stage and tell us a story.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Christopher Akerlind, has designed lighting and occasionally scenery for over 650 productions of theater, opera, and dance across the U.S. and around the world, including 24 shows on Broadway. Chris's recent work includes Waiting for Godot at Theater for a New Audience, Lynn Nottage's play Clyde's on Broadway and at the Mark Taper Forum, The Light in the Piazza, for which he won his first Tony, Paula Vogel's play Indecent, winning him both the Tony and Drama Desk Awards, Rocky the Musical, which garnered him a Tony nomination, Sting's musical The Last Ship, and the Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, for which he was also Tony nominated. Among Chris's other Broadway lighting designs are August Wilson's The Piano Lesson and Seven Guitars, Talk Radio, and the musical Waitress. Chris's numerous shows not on Broadway include Scene with Cranes for CalArts Center for New Performance, the premiere of M. Butterfly for the Santa Fe Opera, and Martha Clarke's devised pieces God's Fool, Angel Reapers, and Cheri. Chris has also received an Obie Award for Sustained Excellence, 4 Drama Desk Awards, the Michael Merritt Award for Design and Collaboration, 2 Chicago Area Joseph Jefferson Awards, as well as numerous nominations for the Drama Desk, Lucille Lortel, and Outer Critics Circle Awards. Chris has taught lighting at schools like CalArts, USC, CMU, and his alma mater, Yale. So for all those reasons and many more, it's my great privilege to have the extraordinarily talented, multi-award-winning lighting designer, Christopher Akerlind, join me on StoryBeat today. Chris, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here, trust me. So let's talk about where all this began. When did you first notice light and lighting and the effect that it had on people, especially in the theater?
In the theater, I was very fortunate. In 1981, I was 19 years old, and I had been away at undergraduate school in Connecticut. I was a music major, actually, at UConn. And what I learned right away, and I was interested in jazz primarily, which I think later on feeds my penchant for improvisation in light. But I decided to take my sophomore year off. And it just so happened at the moment, the Hartford stage was not hiring because they didn't pay me, but they were looking for production interns. And in high school, I had been interested in puppets. I acted a little bit. I certainly stage managed and created some, very basic lighting, and then I had music as well. But I decided I could not spend the next 3 years of my life in a practice room practicing arpeggios and scales.
Right.
So anything that I had achieved as a teenager in jazz was completely intuitive because I never practiced, but I loved playing. That was so great. So, but anyway, in 81 it would have been 81, 82. Yeah. The Hartford Stage Company had just engaged a new artistic director called Mark Lamos, who was a 35-year-old kind of wunderkind. And I had seen projects there that he had done for his first season, and they just blew me away. I love classic plays, and when I'm teaching, I tend to teach classic plays. But there was an Antony and Cleopatra, the Greeks, the Barton Cavender adaptation of the Oresteia, big, fat, juicy productions of these plays. It's a big space to the Hartford stage, and they had just moved into it 3 years before, so it was a relatively new space. But I was unpaid, and I started as a PA, and then did a few productions as PA, and I was always also on the run crew of whatever show I was, PAing, and I did a lot of work. I don't forget exactly how it happened, but they started paying me to be an electrician because it turned out that I was an excellent electrician,
Right.
for what it's worth, and they were great artists working there. John Conklin doing set and costumes, Michael Jurgen, and Pat Collins,
Pat Collins.
who was a huge inspiration to me. I think she died 2 years ago, as I remember, which made me very sad. But she and I really clicked as lighting designer to electrician. And she would come back almost every show at Hartford, and so she always said, just leave the rig up. So there weren't specific plots for specific shows, and this is interesting because it comes out of her all the work that she did in opera, where you're always dealing with a repertory plot anyway.
Right.
So she would come in at the last minute, see some rehearsal, come into the theater, and she would not quite always have thought out what she was doing with which group of lamps. And so occasionally she would say, go over to that group of beam projectors over there and do something with them. And I'd focus them all at one wall. And she loved it. And then in tech, she was very generous with including my participation in some of these looks. There was a moment in that same show where she turned those lights on the big wall, and Mark Lamos was directing, and he said, "Pat, that's amazing! It looks so good." And she said, "Chris Akerlind did that." Um, so so I met a lot of people, Jim Ingalls, and it was not exclusively, but John Conklin did a lot of work there, and I still revere him because I think he's got an amazing dramaturgical imagination.
Do you think that your working as an electrician first taught you a lot about lighting and where angles go and color and all the rest of it?
Yeah, yeah, I absorbed a huge amount of and knowing that I had started this internship, not really knowing I wanted to be in the theater as an alternative to music, but really not knowing what to do. And I think I grasped that I can draw a little bit, but I don't draw like John Lee Beatty or Santo LaQuasta or people like that. So I decided, well, there's this kind of complex engineering thought that goes into creating lighting design, and what came to me easily was images. I can read a play and I can imagine what I would do to it, and then enter director and set designer, and I'm improvisational enough to know about how to take other input, let it collide with my work, and hopefully to create something that nobody on the team may have expected.
You mentioned earlier that you had some improv training and that you were able to use that and translate it into lighting, and you've just said it again. I'm curious, how does one improv lighting? How does that work?
Well, it's I've done a lot of opera too, and I've done a lot of opera in repertory plots. And then the specific plots that I tend to give myself contain, about half of the gear is purposeless when I send in the plot. And it's only after I see some rehearsal and get a feel for the vibe of the show and the structure of the staging that I can start attaching ideas to lights that are in the plot that have no original purpose. And that's what I mean. That's really fun. So you will go from the rehearsal hall on one day, and then you go in first thing in the morning and start the focus. And there's a huge amount of improvisation that I will do to, affect the rig and what the rig can do based on firsthand feeling of the show in the rehearsal hall.
Are you saying you put lights up that you aren't sure what the purpose of them are before you see a rehearsal?
Yeah, I've been able to do this because I'm really quick to figure out what to do with them once I've seen the show. I want to feel the human vibe of the show before I complete, the first pass at focus. And actually, it's what the theater means to me so much is that vibe of humanity, of actors, three-dimensional actors telling us a story, telling us some playwright's story. And that, particularly nowadays, in opposition to all the 2D, entertainments that we have,
Hmm.
makes me feel really good about having spent a life in the theater.
So, how does that affect a production budgetarily for you? If you're not in a theater that already has all these lights, you're having to bring them in.
Yeah.
What happens when you say, I want to rent all these lights
Yeah.
that I don't know what I'm doing with yet? Or do you not tell them
I don't tell them that. Sometimes, production managers will finally, but repeat production managers. For instance, when I left grad school, I worked at Hartford Stage all the time because they knew me from when I was a kid,
Sure.
and other regional theaters too. And so I think people started to trust that I would always pull it off, and that actually by waiting to develop some ideas, that the work had a freshness because it was responding to my being a spectator in the rehearsal hall and being moved by what was being said, by the various compositions that had been created by the set and then the staging, on top of it. And so I never asked. I was actually, I think I did a lot of work. I never broke the budget. I mean, there were things sometimes that the set needed. They were like internal lights and things like that. And I'd say, well, listen, this is what we have to do. You've okayed the set and we have to do this stuff. And so the lighting is going to cost, X amount of dollars. And they're like, well, we didn't budget anything, but you okay to set with light inside it. And the budget for the set doesn't include all the onboard light
Right.
stuff. So it was just what I would always do was give myself basics in a space, all the various different spaces, tiny to large. I love backlight because I love the way I believe that light kind of pushes, and I love backlight because it's pushing the actors toward us
Mm.
above and beyond the fact that it might be pale green and you might be in a world that wants to be pale green, etc. But it's really that sense of the halo of backlight, which for me, metaphorically, I think actors are angels. I mean, sometimes, you can hate them, right? But I do think that it's an angelic instinct to walk on stage and tell us a story. And I'm so moved by actors. I want them to really be pushed out and dimensional, and I want to see their faces. Although there are times, dramatic moments when you don't need to see the face. There can be some contrast, etc.
I sometimes think of backlight and sidelight as carving the actors out of the back end of the space or negative space.
Yeah, dimensionalizing it. And so I have students sometimes, and they put all their gear front of house, so it's all frontal. And I say, it's going to be flat.
Flat.
You got to get some more gear. And I have a rough rule of thumb for me, but also for my students, is that it wants to almost be like a 4-to-1 ratio of lights on stage to lights front of house.
Oh, I think that's right. I think that all of the great lighting comes from the sides and the backs,
That's right.
and some a little bit from the top, and sometimes from up underneath.
Yeah.
That gives you all that dimensionality as you're talking about.
That's right. Yeah. And I think adhering to that and insisting. Now, then, of course, there are what did I do? I did a Tartuffe at the Huntington Theater in Boston a few years ago, and the set had a ceiling. So then you've got to figure it out how to do it from box booms and etc. Because overhead light is taken away from you.
Let's back up half a step, because for those listeners who don't really know what we're talking about, you and I can talk about this all day and we'll have a better understanding than many people. What for you makes lighting necessary and special for productions? Why is light so important?
I think it gives the production visual sizzle, and it also, if you're dealing with, say, a unit set for Shakespeare or something, just an empty space or whatever, that light actually gives detail, and above and beyond the dimensionalizing effect it has on actors versus the background, what they're playing against. I love composition, and I love thinking about simple notions of verticality versus horizontality.
What do you mean by that? Explain verticality versus horizontality.
Yeah, light that kind of comes down, straight down, as opposed to light that's coming low up from low on the sides, which is horizontal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you can't do everything with that, but I start with an essential notion of trying to tell the story of the metaphoric importance of certain composition ideas. I know, and we've all seen it, and we've seen other people do it, and when I get to do it, it's amazing to just use one light, to light a scene. That's the most exciting thing, you can do. So it's composition ideas. Is it, for instance, I throw out to my students, what makes a scene look heavy? what makes a scene look buoyant, and light does that. It's what gives the set and the play unfolding within the set, it gives it that kind of life.
Is it important to establish time of day or tonality of the show?
Yeah, time of day is depending on the style. Like for piano lesson, for instance, or seven guitars. I mean, those were in a essentially a realistic style that I feel like I heightened, but without it becoming a distraction to the idea that I'm just telling the story of what the sun is doing or what the practical lamps are doing in the show, in order to tell the story that August Wilson lays out about what time of day it is. Like, it's very important that Boy Willie and Lyman in piano lesson are banging on the door at 5 o'clock in the morning. The house is asleep, and then they come in and they've got they're excited about he's excited about being at his sister's house, Boy Willie, and they've got this truck full of watermelons, and slowly the house comes alive. The little girl comes down. She's on her way to school. Doker, the uncle, kind of comes out of his room and starts to put French toast on the. And so there's a kind of wonderful sense of blossoming. And then there are a few funny night scenes where Lyman, for instance, brings home a hooker, basically, and it has to feel dark, but it also has to feel kind of romantic because Lyman is a sort of beautiful, shy person. So there's time of day. I think that lighting designers who do that realistic work, it's an amazing craft. But I'm happy that it's not that the work that I've done is exclusive of thinking about time of day. But I love classic plays in a way, particularly Shakespeare, because it's never going to be probably in a realistic set. So you have to figure out how to carve up the space image wise to suit, what, 30 locations in Antony and Cleopatra or something like that.
Do you prefer to light something that is open and empty and is just suggested sets versus a very deeply detailed realistic set?
Yeah, absolutely. Piano lesson was a detailed set, and I loved working on it. But I was also only 29 years old, and I hadn't spent the time in which is not. I would never turn piano lesson down. Particularly in that context with Lloyd Richards directing and August there and rewriting, and
Yeah, no kidding.
I would never turn that down. But if you ask me, what's your favorite kind of context, I would say a simple, non literal set or not time based set in which a lot of different sorts of uh, places and images, etc., need to be created.
Like you could do with dance.
Yeah, exactly. Dance is a perfect example of that. You're given an empty space, and there's nothing more pure than that. And then you have the dancers, these human bodies flinging themselves through space, creating beautiful, again, compositions and beautiful sense of movement. And also, you know, there's always a story to everything that exists in time. You have a beginning, a middle, and an end. I haven't done a lot of dance, but the work I do with Martha Clarke is very dance-like. So, yeah, I just, the older that I've become, I like simple things. And I think sometimes, it's not that I'm anti-scenery, but I think sometimes our sets, the theater's making use of, maybe are too detailed. The primary example I use is that when Shakespeare was writing, 32 of arguably the best plays that have ever been written, he was in an empty space with no
Yes.
with no lighting.
No lighting and no direction in the writing either.
That's right. That's right. No stage directions except the funny exit pursued by bear, etc. So that I love that, and I call it the Elizabethan effect, and that's also in part what I think of the rehearsal. Coming and flying in or training in or something, coming to the rehearsal hall, and going into a big bland room with bright, usually fluorescent, nowadays LED lights to see a rehearsal, and also by virtue of the fact that it's a rehearsal hall and I'm there to see the work, I'm sitting in what's probably the front row. And so that living vibe of human beings singing or speaking is so cool. And so I'm so moved by it that I always want to try to drag something about that simplicity back with me into the theater.
Do you think of yourself as painting in air?
Yeah,
Are you a painter of light?
yeah, yeah. Sometimes I can be a bit of a brutalist.
What does that mean?
It just means I like to gang lots of lights together or have big sources, big bright cold sources, and just turn them on. To find to find something that kind of carves out just a simple notion that in some of these plays life is hard. And I don't think that lighting always wants to prettify or to make pretty images all the time. Sometimes it's funny. I had a cousin who lived outside of New Haven, and she used to come when I was working at Longworth a lot when they were still sort of alive. She'd come and she'd say, "Oh, I loved it, I loved it, I loved it, but why did the light have to be so harsh?" And it's a production of Hamlet, and I said, "Well, listen." Hamlet is a harsh play. Not only that, but
That's a harsh play.
it's set geographically in a kind of a harsh, cold place.
Definitely.
So, I don't know. It's interesting that the expectation is that you'd go to see Hamlet and it would be pink. I
No,
just don't quite understand.
no, no,
I
no.
don't quite understand.
It's steel. It's cold steel.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And Scottish play, and they're Richard III. I mean, they're so hard. And I think one of the things that I love about the theater is that I have always, I mean, since I was a kid, a little bit. I don't know what this means about my upbringing, but it's that I've always sensed the dark side of life. I mean, I can be an ecstatically joyful person, but I can be pretty down about certain things about the way that we Homo sapiens,
It's human.
live life. Yeah, 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 yeah. So I'm happy to also to do a lot of work that spans all that. And I think if you're spanning it, but if you're right in the middle, that's probably the boring place.
Let's look at your actual process in doing what you do. We've talked a little bit about it already, but let's go through that creative process. You get an assignment, you book a job, and aside from reading the script, which you have to do, I assume, what is the first thing that you start to think about once you have a sense of at least the play? Or do you need to talk to director and others before you can start to formulate that?
Yeah, sometimes those things happen in a different sequence. So I might have signed on to a play, and then if it's with a director I frequently work with, have had a preliminary conversation about what are the possibilities. And then I read the play, and I'm very moved by action as opposed to place. Dramaturgical action, murder, revenge. I'm back in the Shakespeare world.
The great classic themes.
That's right. That's right. And then I image very fast. But again, it goes to the improv idea. What I image is just what happens to me, and then I go and have a meeting. Although most meetings these days sadly are over Zoom because they used to be in person, and that was I really loved that part of when you're in person as opposed to Zoom, the meetings can kind of spin off into personal things and anecdotes about things you remember, and it's not that that can't happen on Zoom, but it's less likely. But I love the interaction with the co-collaborators. I can't really start to image for purposes of making a plot until I know what the space is, right? And I know what the ground plan is, and I know what the opportunities for light are. You mentioned that musical I did what 10, 11 years ago now, the Rocky the musical. And that was such a machine. The set was such a machine. There were very little places for overhead. We had a couple of electrics and lots of moving lights, which was good. But that was really an adventure in cobbling, a stark, handsome show from not non-traditional, but not from the overhead for sure, because there was too much in the way.
There was too much in the way, too much of the stuff that was going up and down or in and out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There was a gantry that moved, two gantries that moved up and down stage from one another, and sometimes they had tracks on them, so things would slide in. It was there was so much overhead stuff that I really had to think deeply about. Okay, well, this isn't. You can't just fall back on technique of overhead. And I love a project like that.
You like to be challenged that way.
Yeah, and then my students and other professional lighting designers, they say, "Oh God, you can't do a ceiling." And I said, "Well, why not? Use your engineering imagination and figure it out." And the other one is funny. It's classic. Is that oh, I'd never work on a white set. Again, that's a completely amazing opportunity. And one of the things that a white set does is that it reveals one's use of color a lot. And I think because a lot of people use more colors than I tend to at one time. If you've got a sidelight that's pink from one side and a sidelight that's aqua from the other side, you see that on the floor, and or it bounces up onto the. So you have to, I think, with a white set, you just have to feel confident about picking a light, a color.
I saw in, I think it was 1978, 79 in Los Angeles, I saw the first performance of the first pre-show of Evita that was done in America. It was before it ever got to New York.
Oh wow!
And the thing that blew my mind is the set was on whatever the set was, which was minimal. There was a black floor with white spattered paint on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And that floor literally changed colors into whatever Theron Musser put on it.
Yeah, cool. I saw it when it finally made it to Broadway, and I loved it. I loved the music, and I liked the story quite a lot.
I'm pretty sure it was Theron Musser. Am I right?
I
I'm
think it
pretty
might have been
sure.
one of the Brits. I think it might have been like
Well, it was Hal Prince.
who was it? Yeah, then it might have been yeah, or Ken Billington, or somebody in that family.
So going back a half a step here, do you think about the audience when you're thinking about what you're doing? Do you consider their reaction to what you're presenting?
Not really, because I don't believe that I can ever know that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting about previews is that I do sense the effect of my work. And this is why I love previews, except on Broadway where there are a month of them and it's like gets a little tiresome. But I love previews because you do get, and it's not spoken, but again, it's a vibe from the audience that you can feel like, well, they're not connecting because maybe the faces aren't popping enough, So and sometimes it's not even so easy to put that into a language. I just know that something's wrong. And then because it's a preview, you have the next afternoon of rehearsal to kind of rejigger things. And so it's really an intuitive thing for me. But as I'm making the first pass, it's not that I don't care, but I don't want to get too distracted by what would normally be considered concerns about the light. For instance, it's something that I do intuitively, is that I know that if you shine lights in the audience eyes, they're not going to be very happy.
Yes, definitely.
That, which is not to say that you can't have some bursts, once in a while. We did that in Rocky a lot, but it can't be sustained light in their eyes, because they'll tune out. They won't be able to see. They'll feel assaulted and they'll tune out. Now, having said that, it's these ideas. Philosophically, it changed depending on who the director is. Maybe the director's totally cool with the idea of blinding blinding the audience, and then there could be some directors on the opposite spectrum who wouldn't okay it, ever, even an experiment in trying something like that. So
It worked in rock and roll.
oh sure, well, everybody's high and they're just listening anyway, and so but I think in rock and roll, like, again, the idea of where the focus of the light look is, how are the faces floating in the void and or the complex set or something like that. I have a funny aversion to gobos, because first of all, I like to project real shadows. So if somebody wants, if the show wants, like All My Sons or something, if they, put a tree there and lots of light through the tree and create the shadows that way, as opposed to using gobos, which I find it's a little silly to say because the theater is artificial, but I find them super artificial, and I think too much about the choice of them. And I also have this theory that I might have debunked once or twice in 35 years, that every, if you put like a complex leaf gobo on something, that the eye stays busy tracing the interstices of every single one of those bits and pieces of light. Now, I think broken light is great, but I really love it if it's natural.
So for those that don't know, explain what a gobo is.
A gobo is a piece of with steel, I think, and it's been imprinted and cut out with certain images. So, and they're round, and they go between the gobo is because they go between the lens and the reflect and the light and the lamp which is within the reflector. This is on traditional spotlights, which we still have
It's a pattern.
around. It's a
Makes
pattern.
patterns.
Yeah, we call them templates too, and there are thousands and thousands of them. There are Spirit of 1776 gobos. There are beautiful abstracts, right? And I find that when I use gobo sometimes to break up the light, I put frost in front of it, so I'm not looking at the sharp edge. Because a gobo and a spotlight can be, you can sharpen on it because of the way that the lens system works, and you can also soften it. But you can also sharpen it and then put frost in front of it, which I tend to do. Not always, but these are just basic predilections that I have about patterns.
But you would prefer to create the pattern out of something that's happening on stage naturally, like another human being or a tree or a corner of a building or
Exactly.
something like that,
Exactly. Yeah.
or come
Exactly.
through an actual window frame rather than using a gobo pattern.
That's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't like window gobos. That really feels to me. It always feels like a cop out if the director asks for a window gobo or something. Which sometimes you need in a box set that's three sides, and you have to pretend that the downstage is the fourth wall. You know what a good example of is the kind of shadows that I like are what you normally would see in the classic film noir
Well,
movies.
that's it. Sure.
Right. It's just one source coming through a railing or through a window or projecting up a staircase or something like that. And to me, that's thrilling. Those
Blinds. It makes blinds.
lines.
That's really good noir stuff. Casablanca has a lot of it.
Yeah. 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 And those are actual effects that they managed to get together in the film studio. And to me, the effect of it is really great.
Do you do on some shows, I'm sure some you don't need to, but do you find yourself needing to do research on some shows for imagery or pictorialization of things?
Yeah. I have a pretty good visual memory. But I'm always, you know, running to the library, or used to be. That doesn't happen quite so often anymore. But I also like to be. The great thing about a library, or even the internet, to some degree, is to be surprised by an image. So you go out and you're thinking, well, maybe some images of light at Stonehenge might be right for a certain play. But then on the way to Stonehenge, in the stacks, you you find a book about some other rock formations, and it turns out you start opening up, and the photographs are like awesome, and right exactly what you feel like you need. So that's another role of accident, I think, in research, which I think is really really great. Um, I tend to like to be unsettled.
What does that mean? You'd like things that are hard to understand or follow, or what do you mean by unsettled?
I like things that I have to think more deeply about applying, that I have to construct a unique theatrical rationale for before you start using them, and then hope that it works. I mean, these days it's a big problem with younger students, or even older students, but younger students who you're doing Romeo and Juliet, and they go and they all you get back as research are Renaissance pictures of balconies. It's like it has to be more creative than that, right? Because there have been too many Renaissance balconies in productions of Romeo and Juliet. So how do you take something, to decide that the early part of the play might be morning like and the latter part of the play might be night like, or vice versa? And then find interesting images of those things and find a quality of light or pattern or color or something that's going to suit your production.
What would you say is the most difficult space you've ever had to light, and how did you solve that issue?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Um,
Was it rocky?
no, no, because we all had engineered things into the set that were going to work. We spent oodles of studio time on that with Chris Barreca, the set designer, and we really figured it out. And then there was sometimes in the tech where I would have to say, I'm not going to be able to get this until the next time we make a pass through this particular look for a particular scene or something. And I like to be working with directors who understand that. But there's some who are very impatient and say, no, we're making a look now. And that look probably ends up relying too much on front light, right? And so the look is handicapped by the fact that it's flat, just as an aside.
Well, that's a lot of the problem of any production is time. How much rehearsal time do you have? How much tech time do you have? You don't have an unlimited amount of time usually. And that's part of the job of all the designers is here's the budget, here's the time you have, and go make it happen within that parameter.
Yeah, I find it fun. My colleagues sometimes and directors will complain, about it. But I feel like accept the context financially, spatially, time-wise, etc. Accept it and run with it. We're all supposed to come into this with imagination, right? And so I mean, just about the most difficult thing, even though I think it's probably a solution, but for somebody to say, okay, we're building a 1, 2, 3, 4, a six-sided box, 8-sided box, whatever, but it's a box, and the action's going to happen inside, and you have to light it, but no way to get light in the box, But to me,
does it have a roof on it? Does it have a ceiling on it?
Probably, yeah. But to me, that sort of problem, just even hypothetically, that I get excited about that.
In your thinking, what would be the first thing you would think to do? Do you have to implant lights into the set somehow?
Yeah, or they're carrying battery operated things, or you have to do something. But then the interesting twist on that is that so they're lit inside the box, who can see them? Right?
I once had a thought, and I don't think it'll ever happen, but that you would have a show in which the audience was given miners' helmets and colored swatches. And during the show, they were lighting the show and holding color up in front of the light.
Yeah, I love that. And hopefully there's a nice dramaturgical link to what's happening in the play or opera or dance.
Well, that would have to be like if you were doing a show in a mine. Yeah. That's how you would do it. Yeah.
That's cool. But it's the challenge is, first of all, it's to be unique as a lighting designer. Like I wouldn't want to be doing work that looked too much like someone else's. And then in the end, it takes a very refined viewer to sort of see the difference between my work,
of course,
and Ken Billington's work or Robert Roselle's work, and yet it's there. I think my work, that there is something distinct, and that goes back to the backlight idea. I really push backlight really hard because I like the look of it, and I like what it does to performers, and in particular that it pushes them towards us.
I have found over time that even some of the most sophisticated directors that I've worked with over time, they don't understand what it is that the lighting designer's doing. Yeah. Some do, but some have no idea at all and don't care. They just want it to look a certain way. And so you're accommodating their vision.
Sometimes they don't even care about what it looks like. They're just like, as long as I can see the faces, I'm good. Right. But to me, it's really great to collaborate on, what's the style of the show? What are the composition ideas of the show? And then everybody's working together, hopefully, towards some version of whatever you come up with.
Back when I was first starting, which is a long time ago, because I'll let the audience know, I also have done a lot of lighting design, so I have a little bit of an understanding of what Chris is talking about. Back in the day, it was manually operated lighting boards, and you were running potentiometers up and down for dimming and switching scenes and so on. You were manually lighting the show from a board. Today, it's all computer driven. So how important is the programmer and how important is the operator?
Well, the operator's job is really to push the go button.
It's just button pushing.
When prompted by the stage manager, so that better be easy. Right? Or if it's not easy for your op, you probably got the wrong person.
Yeah.
But programmers they're great. The ones that I love figure out what I'm doing and are always working to make the program, the mode of the technique of the programming, etc., kind of true to where I'm coming from. And with like big effects and things like that, I let the programmer start or work with the assistant or something. because I'm not the kind of person. I mean, I know the ETC boards very, very well, but I would say I'm a little lazy on behalf of the programmer to give them a kind of a chance to participate by making lightning or something like that, and then they'll make something, or an assistant will make something, and it's like dead on, or they'll make something and it's 80% on, and so I'll go into it and just refine the 20% that is not doing it for me. So program, and I can spit out words very fast, so I'm a very fast programming lighting designer, meaning what I'm saying, and so I value speed too, and there are some real fast ones.
Does it drive you a little crazy when they're not fast?
Oh my god, yes. It's so, it's like they're not, it's not that they're doing something personal to you, it's just that they can't keep up with, and so then I find myself having to slow down. Great anecdote. Years and years ago, early 90s, I was doing a project at the Bush Memorial in Hartford, Connecticut, and it was a Hartford ballet, and it was a union house, and the electricians were all wonderful, and the head electrician was really great, and he was the programmer. So we start working as a live tech with the dances, etc. And I'm getting nowhere. And I'd ask for 15, and I would get 3, 4, 6, 7, 8. Because his fingers were so fat that when he pushed like 6, you'd also get 5 and 7, right, it gets over 56 or whatever. And so we got nowhere, and he was so humble about it, and the steward, the IA steward, actually gave us an extra 4-hour call because the ME had said, listen, I'm not doing this very well. And that's where, in that local, he remained the master electrician, but they started to train a guy with thinner fingers to do the board. And it was some weird early computer board where the keypad was like the size of a telephone. It was like a little teeny tiny buttons.
Sure. And his fingers were too big for the job.
Yes. Yeah.
So we've talked about collaborating at least a couple of times in this show, and you have to be a collaborator to do what you're doing because you're dealing with directors and electricians and producers and everybody else. What do you think is the best way for a designer to think about the collaboration or the collaborative process?
Well, I think you want to be able to articulate what it is that you think you're doing and or have done as a defense of what you have done. Now, sometimes with producers, maybe even with directors with whom I have no simpatico. I mean, I've lived my whole career to try to find directors with whom I have a rough simpatico.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are, producers who I see that I'm talking and trying to convince, and I can see in their eyes that they're not hearing it or not understanding it. And so then I decide to cut to the chase and do what they ask.
That's a simple way to solve it.
It's a simple way to solve it. And sometimes by that point, I just want to move on to the next thing. And they are signing the paychecks, the contract checks, the fee checks. So, and with directors are important to one's career.
Yeah.
But there have been directors I've worked with who I said it to myself in the middle of the first production, I'm never doing this again. And it's just, what's it called? The way that we relate to one another. There's just some relationships that don't work out.
It's a chemical thing.
That's the word I was going for. It's a chemistry thing, and set designers tend to like my work because I don't destroy sets, and also costume designers like my work because I essentially start from a white light perspective, and so nothing's going to change the color of their scarlet dress, right? It's going to be revealed in a way that they have imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm usually I think perceptive enough to, from seeing the rehearsal, a run through in the rehearsal hall, that I get it. Even when I know that the it of it isn't necessarily to my taste, I get how to do it pretty fast.
Do you think of yourself as serving the vision of the director, or are you trying to serve your own vision?
Both, and in varying degrees. right? So there are some directors you work with, and if you're not serving them 100%, forget about it. But then there are some directors, like Anne Bogart and Martha Clarke, for that matter, they sit back and wait to see what I do, and they get jazzed by that. And these are mostly people who've worked with me before who trust that I'm going to do something that they appreciate and, for lack of a better word, approve of. I like those relationships, and not to. It's interesting because I've had a lot of good luck working with women, and what I find is that there is a not maternal, but there is a
Instinctual.
instinctive way of relating to what I do.
Hmm.
Which is not to say there are never notes, etc. But in that kind of relaxed situation, I'll do any note, because I like that place of process very much. But they are the key to working. Young people have to understand that if they're not making the director feel that she is getting something, but whether they know that I've intuited it or whether they know that they've asked for it and I've given it to them, they have to feel content with it. Otherwise, you won't be asked back.
Right. And that's part of the game, isn't it? Is we've already
Yeah.
alluded to that before, that being friends with a director or producer, whoever, may get you another job. And then it becomes a monetary thing for you. It's a job. It's work.
I mean, work is good. It certainly was. It certainly was important in the early days when I was living in a tiny apartment in Brooklyn, and I wanted all the work I could get. One of the nice things about being a little older is I can pick and choose a little tiny bit. But back then, I took
Well, sure.
the height of it. I would do 25 productions a year, and if you do the
Wow.
math, that's basically one every 2 weeks.
Wow. That's a lot
Yeah.
of productions as a lighting
It's a lot
designer.
of productions, yeah, and so I was juggling lots of ideas and drawing light plots on coffee tables, and it was crazy, and I was traveling a lot, but I loved it. I was so excited to be in that place.
You're not still drafting on paper, are you?
I do roughs on paper.
You do roughs on paper.
Yeah, roughs on paper, and then I hand it to. I haven't drawn a light plot in probably 15, 17 years.
It's all done in a computer now, right?
Yeah, it's all computer drafted and digitally drafted, and I'm at a point in my career where I, either because I'm teaching or because of where my career is, there's always money for an assistant. So I'll hand a rough to an assistant with the sort of completed paperwork that helps with certain details of the drawing, and then I get it back, and the producer pays for the assistant. Hopefully.
Hopefully. What's your absolute favorite thing to do as a lighting designer?
It's interesting because I have huge anxiety about it too, but make the first look.
Make the first look.
Make the first look, because until you do that, until you start to turn things on, um, you have no idea what you're doing. You think, you might think, oh, I focused the show in such a way, I've plotted the show in such a way, I thought about the show. But in fact, you have no idea until you turn something on. And I do not like previs. I don't like that. I find it cartoonish, and even if I had it available to me, the assistants all want to do that because they're all so excited about the software, etc. But
Well, you probably have big concepts in your head, in your mind's eye, and then you need to play that out by seeing it in
yeah,
reality.
yeah. And most of the time, I think it's really funny that for somebody who's lit 650 productions or something, I'm always nervous. I never trust that I'm going to be able to do it again. So then after you get the first look in there, you can kind of relax and know that there's something about the rig and the focus and my own imagination and collaboration with everybody else that's going to work. And that's a huge relief. I tend not to like closure. I hate opening night because I'll just sit there and see everything that's not done, and that drives me bananas. But the idea of the top of the tech and everything's a blank slate, and you throw on a light. It's funny, just a little teaching anecdote. I observe a lot of tech at CalArts, and they all start by saying they'll start the very first, look, and they'll say, "Well, let's see 3 at 30." Totally. It's like, turn it to full. See what it does, and then you can almost back it off, right? But it's like, so 3 and 30, you're not seeing anything profound, or something that can lead you to other ideas. Get some courage up and turn it on to full.
Clearly, you are into the intensity of light, like you said, brutal force in the way that you come at it.
Yeah.
So that's what you're trying to teach them, is see everything, and then it's always easier to back down
Yeah.
than it is to build up.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. And peers of mine don't understand this also, and the students I focus from the auditorium. I want to see what the lamp is going to look like from the place in which I'm cueing the show.
Do you need a body to stand there for you?
Sometimes an assistant will be a body, but I've become very good at 2 foot upstage, verbally talking it through. But I run into the inevitable if I'm standing down on the apron or something and a light comes on and they point it at me at the apron. It's like, no, this goes against the staircase on the. There's something about wanting to see it as it will be seen. And what I have found is that it's an more efficient use of focus time, because if you're standing in it on stage, you're not seeing it the way that you see it. And what it does is that it cuts down on refining focus notes.
So I think that the listeners are not going to know what we're talking about. That is to say that when a lighting designer focuses lights, they typically will stand on the stage where the light goes, and they wait for an electrician to push the light into position for them where it's supposed to go. You like to step out into the audience, not be on stage, and see where the light's going from the audience's perspective.
Yeah. And I think it's more like I'm calling brushstrokes in a way. So a light comes on and I know that it's going to actually range across the space and land on an important staircase or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can detail composition with shutters are mechanisms so that the light, if it's it's an ellipsoidal reflector kind of light, that you can shake the beam, which is also how gobos, which we were talking about earlier,
gobos have to go into ellipsoidals. They won't work in a Fresnel.
That's right. Yeah. Although I back in the day, grad school, sometimes they were cabaret spaces, and all I had was 6-inch Fresnels, and I would take black, which is basically black tin foil.
Sure.
Put it in a 6-inch Fresnel frame, and just with my just poke 3 holes in it, and it would break it up, but it was never going to be sharp or anything like that. But
no,
there are all sorts of things that I think you learn about light by being in small spaces with less impressive inventories of lights and only 6 dimmers or something like that.
And no power.
There's again, and one improvises in that sense. And I think that you have to think of, in order for the light that you're making to remain alive in some ways, there has to be some improvisational effect of it in a way. And there would be time when I focus too, because of the improvisational ideas. Say one of those lights that I had spoken of would come up, and I'll decide, okay, that should be a top light on the staircase. And then I'm thinking about it, think also about the rehearsal that I've seen, and I'll say, no. Let's instead turn it all the way upright and just light that wall. And that confuses electricians, except the electricians who get it. And they get it, and they get the spirit of it, and they like it, and they like what I liked, in that anecdote about working for Pat Collins 100 years ago, was that she appreciated it. She showed appreciation, and she was very generous with her time. And I really like electricians who, some of them are so cool that it's like aloof. And, and you say, okay, well, turn it a different way, and they don't get it, and they get pissy, and that's no good. So.
Well, there are technicians and there are creative technicians.
Yeah, right. Yep.
I've been having an absolutely marvelous conversation. Probably going to baffle some people listening to this because it's fairly technical, but I love it. And I've been having this great conversation with Chris Akerlind for a little more than an hour at this point, and we're going to wind the show down. And I'm just wondering, in all of your experiences, you've already told us some really fantastic stories, but I'm wondering if you have a story that you can share that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or maybe just plain funny beyond what you've already told us.
Yeah, I won't name the theater's name, but it was an off-Broadway house that had a small space, which was adjacent to the big space, and it was really tiny. It only had 60 dimmers, and it was a little kind of thrust, and it had only 2 rows of seats, left, center, and right, going around it. And I was doing this play called Day Standing on Its Head. And it was about a professor in a UC, some sort of a California college, who was having a midlife crisis. And so it turns out, so there are 60 dimmers. And then, in tallying up the scenes, there were 70 locales. It was total. It was like there was a noir-esque quality to it. There was a realistic quality to it. So I really put these 60 dimmers and maybe 80 lights. I was pushing it. But the writer, it was a premiere. So the writer was there, the director was there, and they loved what I was doing. And there was some of it was contrasty, but when you're only two rows away, it doesn't need to be hugely realized, particularly when you're sitting there over time, you get to know. And I think, yeah, there were other characters, but it was primarily the professor on stage having this nervous breakdown. And so at the time, the artistic director of the theater was on some sort of health leave. And so her associate artistic director, of course, had all the artistic director power. And he came to the final dress rehearsal, and we were all so happy with what we'd achieved. And at the production meeting afterwards, he held up his hand and he said, "Listen, I got to tell you, I can't see a thing up there." And he pointed. Now, I hadn't, of my 60 dimmers, I hadn't spent dimmers on in that intimate situation where the show wanted to be kind of noir-esque anyway. So he points up to where the front lights usually go, and he said, "There's no front light up there." I'm thinking, oh God. And the writer said, "Listen, I think it's okay. I think we should just go through." And he said, "No, I insist. Let's get some front lights up there." And so the production manager, who I knew fairly well, he's in the back going, "We'll work it out. We'll work it out." And so the next day I came in, there were 12 front lights, 6 for upstage and 6 for downstage. And they were divided left, center, right, and left, center, right. And they had programmed them into every cue at like 10%, and then had put quadruple heavy blue color in them. So the light there was actually nothing coming out of them. But when you looked up, you saw front lights with light in the vents, etc. And you saw that the front lights were always on. And so hilariously, at the production meeting, the associate artistic director turned to me and said, "Chris, thank you so much. The work is so changed." And it was essentially exactly the work that he had seen the night before with 12 fraudulent front lights that the production manager had put in just to solve the problem and move on. It's such a wonderful example. What's an amazing thing about light and working in collaboration is how much you learn about how people see.
Oh, sure.
And we all see differently. And this guy was basically blind, but he was convinced that having those lights up there with the light in the vents meant the light was on and that it was doing something to the look.
And he didn't want to seem like he didn't understand.
Right.
Because you'd set something up and he wanted to be sure he understood what you were doing.
Yeah.
And as long as he was convinced he understood it.
Everybody who was in on it, it was terribly embarrassing for him. But it never came up. He was happy. He walked out. We had a preview the next night, and the show wasn't a hit, but it looked good.
Well, that's all that counts.
That's all that counts.
So last question for you today, Chris. You've already given us a ton of things to chew on and advice and so on throughout this entire conversation, but I'm wondering if you have a single solid piece of advice that you like to give to either your students or someone just starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit and trying to get to that next level. What do you tell people?
Yeah. It's the director's stupid. To use who was that? Bill Clinton, right? It's the economy stupid, right? And you don't get work without directors. So the best thing that you can do is cozy up to them, and that's probably the wrong word, but you want them to like you, and you want them to like your work, and you want them to like working with you. So I, particularly in grad programs or undergrad programs, I say build a relationship with the director. And if it's really solid, you can go with wherever that director goes. It's not going to solve every problem of finding work. The way to find it and to get it and to sustain it, it's all controlled by the director, from a human resources.
Right. Because they're the ones that are going to insist that you be their lighting designer.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And their name is at the top of the masthead. They control everything, even though sometimes they don't control a thing, but they get all the credit for it. that's the that's the interesting. I mean, there was one director in grad school who went on to become the associate artistic director at New York Theater Workshop, which of course later went on to produce Rent, etc. And I became the resident there because he spoke so highly of me, and so it was a great entree into working in New York in the off Broadway because I was being reviewed, etc. And so it's that relationship from grad school, which it wasn't cultivated so much as it was just the way things worked out. We were working together and we liked it. And then he carried that affinity for my work. He carried that to New York with him. And so it was a huge part of my, the downbeat of what became my career.
Well, that is a very solid piece of advice because you aren't going to be able to just generate, I want to work in your theater. Someone has to
Right.
actually bring you in to work on the show.
Yeah. And there have been one or two times when a playwright will say, I think Chris Akerlind would be really good to do this, even though the director had a different idea. But here, at the end of the day, you can know all you want about moving lights, about the gear, blah, blah, blah. All those moving lights are never going to get you a job. Good work is going to get you a job. So concentrate on the image and how it moves us in the spectators.
Things that really touch people in their heart and they can feel something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Chris Akerlind, this has been an absolutely wonderful hour plus on StoryBeat today, and I can't thank you enough for your time, your interest, and your wisdom in all this and your energy. My goodness. Thank you very much for spending this time with me today and telling the audience all about the world of light.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Steve.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.